The house stood untouched by time. Towering gates, pristine gardens, and the grand estate beyond them, all just as she had left it. Yet, to her, it was nothing more than a gilded cage she had long escaped. Aurora Sinclair adjusted the cuffs of her tailored suit, her sharp gaze scanning the mansion that once felt like a prison. Years ago, she had walked away with nothing, her presence unnoticed, her absence barely acknowledged. Now, she returned, not as the forgotten daughter of the Sinclair family, but as the name the world revered. Aurora Laurent, best-selling author, billionaire CEO, a woman untouchable. A sleek black car pulled up behind her. Her assistant, Nathan, stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, glancing at the looming mansion. "You don't owe them anything." Aurora's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no warmth in it. "I know." The gates opened, and as she stepped inside, the past and present collided. The girl they had ignored was gone, and this time, they would have no choice but to see her. Aurora walked through the gates with measured steps, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. Each step felt like a challenge to the ghosts of her past, a reminder that she was no longer the girl who had left in silence all those years ago. The mansion loomed ahead, grand and imposing, but she no longer felt small beneath its shadow. The last time she stood here, she had been just Aurora Sinclair, the overlooked daughter, the unwanted presence, the family's greatest disappointment. Now, she was Aurora Laurent. A butler opened the grand doors before she could knock, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. "And Miss Sinclair?" She didn't correct him. Instead, she simply inclined her head, stepping inside. The familiar scent of expensive wood polish and freshly cut roses filled the air, triggering memories she had long buried. The house was as cold as ever. From the grand staircase, voices echoed, casual, familiar, oblivious to the storm that had just walked through their doors. "Mother, have you decided which charity gala we're attending this season?" A smooth, practiced voice asked. Victoria, the perfect daughter, the one they had always chosen. "Not yet, darling. I'm waiting for your father's approval," came the reply, distant but recognizable. Eleanor Sinclair, the woman who had taught Aurora that silence was a virtue and love was conditional. Aurora's lips twitched. Some things never changed. The butler hesitated, shifting nervously. "Should I announce you, miss?" Aurora turned to him, her gaze cool and unreadable. "No need. Let's see how long it takes them to notice I'm here." With that, she made her way toward the grand sitting room, where the Sinclair family gathered in their usual, polished perfection. This time, they would see her. This time, she wasn't the one waiting to be acknowledged. Aurora stepped into the sitting room like she belonged there. She didn't announce herself, didn't make a grand entrance. She simply existed in the space, waiting to see how long it would take for them to notice. The Sinclairs were gathered in their usual elegance. Her mother, Eleanor, sat on the velvet chaise, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup. Her father, Charles Sinclair, read the financial section of the newspaper, his expression passive, indifferent. And then there was Victoria, perched beside their mother, flipping through a tablet, her long, manicured nails tapping against the screen. They were the very picture of wealth and prestige. Unbothered. Untouched. Aurora took a seat in one of the armchairs across from them, crossing her legs with a grace that had been learned, not inherited. Minutes passed. The butler had left. The room remained oblivious. She waited. She wondered how long it would take for them to truly see her. Finally, it was Victoria who noticed first. She glanced up from her tablet, ready to dismiss whoever had joined them, but the moment her gaze met Aurora's, she froze. Her fingers twitched, her lips parted in stunned silence. Eleanor noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor and frowned, following Victoria's gaze. The teacup slipped from her fingers. It crashed against the floor, porcelain shattering, tea spilling like an ink stain on the pristine white carpet. "Aurora?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying the name would confirm something she didn't want to believe. Charles lowered his newspaper then, his sharp eyes locking onto her. His brows furrowed, confusion flickering across his face before something unreadable settled there. Aurora tilted her head, watching them all with quiet amusement. Surprised? Victoria blinked, regaining some composure. You. She looked her up and down, eyes narrowing slightly. You're back. Aurora smiled, but it wasn't warm. Observant as always, dear sister. Eleanor exhaled sharply, as if she'd been holding her breath. We thought you were, she hesitated, unable to find the right words. Lost, Aurora supplied. Gone? Forgotten. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the armrest. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? Silence. Charles studied her carefully, his businessman's mind already assessing, calculating. Why are you here? He finally asked, his voice cool, unreadable. Aurora's smile didn't waver. What? No, welcome home. Eleanor swallowed. You left without a word, Aurora. You disappeared for years. And now you just show up? Aurora shrugged. I figure it was time. She glanced around, her gaze sweeping over the room, the luxury, the wealth, the family that had once ignored her. You always taught me the world doesn't wait for people like me. So I didn't wait. And look where it got me. Victoria scoffed, regaining her usual sharpness. And where is that exactly? Aurora let the question hang in the air before leaning back, her posture relaxed, powerful. You'll find out soon enough. She wasn't here to beg for a place in their world. She was here to show them she had built one of her own. Victoria's scoff was expected. So was Eleanor's poorly concealed distress. But it was Charles's silence that intrigued Aurora the most. Her father was not an emotional man, nor was he impulsive. He was calculated, always weighing risks and rewards. And right now, he was trying to figure out what she was. Aurora, Eleanor tried again, her voice softer, almost hesitant. Where have you been all these years? Aurora tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Everywhere, she answered vaguely. Victoria rolled her eyes. So, what, you ran off and played traveler? She smirked. And now you're back expecting what? A warm welcome. Aurora chuckled, a low, amused sound. Oh, Victoria, you think too small. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card, placing it on the glass coffee table between them. Charles leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze narrowing as he read the bold lettering. Aurora Laurent, CEO, Laurent Enterprises. A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor's lips parted in disbelief. Victoria frowned, confusion flashing across her face before suspicion set in. But it was Charles's reaction that mattered most. His gaze lifted from the card to Aurora, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. You changed your name, he finally said. Aurora's smirk was cool. I changed everything. Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. Laurent Enterprises? Never heard of it. Aurora didn't even blink. You will. Charles exhaled slowly, setting the card down carefully. I see. His voice was measured, but Aurora knew better. He was intrigued, which meant she had already won the first battle. You're a CEO? Eleanor asked, still processing. Of what, exactly? Aurora leaned back, deliberately taking her time before answering. Technology. Investments. Publishing. I have my hands in a bit of everything. She glanced at Victoria. Even fashion, though I doubt you'd be able to keep up. Victoria's face darkened. Excuse me? Eleanor cleared her throat, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. And why, exactly, are you here now? Aurora let the question settle in the air, taking in the mix of emotions flickering across their faces. Shock, disbelief, curiosity, and, in Victoria's case, poorly veiled resentment. Then finally she smiled. Business, she answered simply. Charles's eyes sharpened. What kind of business? Aurora stood, smoothing out her blazer. You'll find out soon enough. I have a meeting scheduled with the Sinclair Group's board tomorrow morning. Eleanor's breath hitched. The board? Victoria shot up from her seat. You're working with us? Aurora met her sister's gaze with an eerie calm. No, dear sister. I'm not working with you. She picked up her business card and tucked it back into her pocket. I'm here to buy you out. Silence.
Cold. Stunned.
Disbelieving. Aurora let them sit with it. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving them to grasp the reality of the situation. This wasn't just a visit. This was a takeover. You're here to what? Victoria's voice sharpened, her composure cracking. Aurora turned back slightly, watching the disbelief twist her sister's perfect features. You heard me. Eleanor placed a hand over her chest, as if steadying herself. This is ridiculous, she breathed. Aurora, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but the Sinclair Group is not for sale. Aurora arched a brow. Are you sure about that? Charles, who had been silent until now, finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You have the capital for a move like this? His tone was sharp, testing, as if he didn't quite believe it. Aurora smiled, cold, knowing. Do you really think I'd come here empty-handed? Silence. Victoria let out a breathy, incredulous laugh. You're bluffing. Aurora stepped forward slowly, letting the weight of her presence settle over them. You should know better than anyone, Victoria, she said, voice smooth as silk. I never bluff. Eleanor shook her head, trying to regain control of the conversation. This is absurd. You've been gone for years. And now, out of nowhere, you expect us to believe that you... She gestured toward Aurora, as if struggling to even comprehend the thought. You're capable of taking over this family's company? Aurora tilted her head slightly, amused by their disbelief. I don't expect anything. I know. Victoria's eyes flashed. You don't belong in this world, she spat. I am the next in line to inherit Sinclair Group, not you. Aurora's smirk deepened. Well, I suppose we'll see what the board has to say about that tomorrow. Victoria's face paled. Eleanor inhaled sharply. And Charles? He simply stared at her, the gears in his mind turning. Aurora let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words settle in their bones. Then, with a satisfied smile, she turned toward the door. I'll see you all at the meeting. And with that, she walked away, leaving her past behind her. The Sinclair Group boardroom was just as Aurora remembered, grand, sleek, intimidating. A long glass table stretched across the room, surrounded by men and women who had once ignored her existence. Today, they would have no choice but to see her. She sat at the far end of the table, her tailored black suit sharp against the bright morning light streaming through the tall windows. She didn't speak, didn't fidget. She simply existed in the space, waiting for the game to begin. Across from her, Charles Sinclair sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Eleanor sat beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Victoria, dressed in her usual pristine white, leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, looking both irritated and wary. Around them, the board members murmured in hushed voices, trading glances as they skimmed through the documents that had been placed before them. Aurora allowed them a moment to digest. Then she spoke. As you can see in the proposal before you, she said, her voice steady, commanding, Laurent Enterprises has acquired a significant number of Sinclair Group shares over the past 2 years. She turned her gaze to Charles. Enough to demand a seat at this table. Victoria let out a sharp laugh, the sound hollow. You bought shares? What, like some petty investor? Aurora didn't look at her. She looked at the board. I am not an investor, Miss Sinclair. She leaned forward slightly. I am a contender. A tense silence settled over the room. Charles exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. You've made your point. What do you want? Aurora met his gaze head-on. Control. A murmur rippled through the board. Eleanor's grip on her pen tightened. Victoria stiffened. You can't be serious, Eleanor finally said. Aurora turned to her, a cool smile playing at her lips. Why not? The board is already aware of the company's financial struggles. She gestured toward the files in front of them. Debt rising. Market shares slipping. Investors getting nervous. You need a solution. And you think you're the solution? Victoria snapped. Aurora didn't even blink. I know I am. Charles's expression darkened. You may have shares, Aurora, but you don't have enough to take control. Aurora's smirk deepened. That's where you're wrong. She reached into her bag and pulled out another folder, sliding it across the table. The board members flipped through the documents, their eyes widening as realization set in. I've already secured the remaining shares I need to claim majority ownership, she said smoothly. As of this morning, Laurent Enterprises owns 51% of Sinclair Group. A sharp intake of breath. A chair scraped against the floor. Eleanor's face drained of color. Victoria slammed her hands on the table. You're lying. Aurora turned to her, utterly unfazed. Would you like to check the records? The boardroom fell into a heavy silence. Charles Sinclair, the man who had once dismissed her as a failure, sat rigid in his chair, his calculating mind struggling to process the reality before him. Aurora leaned back, crossing her legs. Let me make this simple, she said, voice like ice. I'm not asking for control. I own it. A slow smirk curled her lips as she delivered the final blow. I am the new CEO of Sinclair Group. Silence. Cold, deafening silence. Aurora let them sit with it, savoring the weight of her victory. She had returned. And this time, there was nothing they could do to stop her. The moment the board meeting ended, Charles, Eleanor, and Victoria retreated to Charles's private office, the tension so thick it could suffocate. Victoria was the first to explode. This is insane. How the hell did she get 51%? How did we not see this happening? She paced furiously, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She walked in here like she owned the damn place, and now she actually does? Eleanor sat down, pressing her fingers to her temples. This can't be happening. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge of panic beneath it. She was nothing, a girl who ran away with nothing but spite in her heart. How did she come back like this? Charles remained silent, staring out of the massive glass window overlooking the city. His fingers were steepled, his expression unreadable. Victoria spun toward him. Say something. Charles finally turned, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. She won this round. But that doesn't mean she'll win the war. Eleanor inhaled sharply. You're saying we fight her? Of course we fight her. Charles's voice was cold, decisive. She thinks taking control is enough. But control means nothing if you don't have loyalty. He looked between them. We built this company. The board members, the investors, the employees, they are our people. Aurora might own Sinclair Group on paper, but that doesn't mean they'll follow her. Victoria's lips curled into a slow smirk. So we turn them against her. Exactly, Charles said. We make it impossible for her to lead. We create doubt. We weaken her position from the inside. Eleanor hesitated. What if she's stronger than we think? She's already outmaneuvered us once. Charles's jaw tightened. Then we make sure she doesn't do it again. He turned to Victoria. You still have connections in the media, don't you? Victoria's eyes gleamed with malice. Of course I do.
Good.
Then it's time we remind the world who Aurora really is. Eleanor frowned. What are you planning? Charles's expression darkened. She's been gone for years. No one knows what she's been doing. We find anything, a scandal, a weakness, something that will turn the public and the board against her. He met Eleanor's gaze. We'll make her tenure as CEO the shortest in history. Victoria grinned. I love a good character assassination. Eleanor, however, still looked uneasy. And if that fails? Charles's gaze turned to ice. Then we remind Aurora that she's still a Sinclair. Victoria blinked. What does that mean? It means, Charles said, his voice low and dangerous, that if we can't take the company back, we take her back. Eleanor's eyes widened. Charles, you don't mean? I do, he said sharply. She thinks she's above us now, but blood is blood. If public ruin doesn't bring her to her knees, then we force her back into this family, whether she wants it or not. A heavy silence filled the office. Then Victoria smirked. Well, she said, crossing her arms, this just got interesting. Aurora sat in her new office, the office that once belonged to her father. The scent of leather and old money filled the space, but she could already see it transforming. Her presence alone had changed the very air inside. She knew Charles wouldn't accept defeat. She knew Victoria wouldn't sit still. She knew Eleanor would hesitate, but she would never truly choose Aurora over them. They would come for her. But she had spent years preparing for this moment. As she stared out at the skyline, her lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. Let them try. Aurora expected the attack. It started subtly. A few whispers in the media, an anonymous article questioning her qualifications. Then, the headlines followed. Mysterious CEO takes over Sinclair Group. But who is Aurora Laurent? Runaway heiress or corporate fraud? Laurent Enterprises, a house of cards? She leaned back in her chair, reading the latest smear piece with an amused smile. Predictable. Victoria was playing dirty, using her media ties to plant doubts. Charles, meanwhile, had gone for a more strategic approach, pressuring board members, reminding them where their loyalties should lie. Aurora wasn't worried. She had expected worse. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Her assistant, Damien, entered, his expression tight. You were right. The Sinclairs are trying to sway the board. Charles met with 3 of them last night. Victoria's been in talks with investors. Aurora's smirk didn't waver. Let them. Damien hesitated. And the media storm? Aurora reached for her phone and dialed. A smooth, deep voice answered. I was wondering when you'd call. Lucas, she greeted. I assume you've seen the headlines? Lucas Grayson chuckled. They really thought a few hit pieces would shake you? They'll have to try harder. Aurora's tone was cool. But since they insist on playing this game, let's remind them why they should fear me. A pause. Then Lucas's voice turned sharp. You want me to release it? Aurora's smile sharpened. Do it. The next morning, the Sinclair family had barely finished their breakfast when the real headlines dropped. The Sinclair Group scandal, hidden financial crisis exposed. Corruption at the highest levels? Questionable deals surface. Leaked documents reveal internal mismanagement under Charles Sinclair. Victoria nearly choked on her coffee. What the hell is this? Eleanor snatched up her tablet, scrolling with wide eyes. This can't be real. Charles, usually calm and composed, clenched his jaw. She had this planned. Aurora had done more than just take control, she had dug. She had found the financial skeletons they thought were buried. Misallocated funds, deals that bordered on illegal investor manipulation. And now it was all public. Victoria shot up from her seat. She's destroying our reputation. She's destroying us, Eleanor whispered. Charles exhaled slowly, rage simmering beneath his controlled expression. Clever girl. He looked up at his daughters, his voice like steel. This isn't over. But deep down, for the first time, he wasn't sure how to stop her. Aurora sipped her espresso, watching the chaos unfold from her office window. The Sinclairs had underestimated her. She didn't just come back to fight. She came back to win. And she was just getting started. Charles Sinclair never lost. Or at least, that's what he had believed, until now. Aurora had done more than humiliate them. She had struck at the core of Sinclair Group, exposing the rot they had carefully hidden for years. Now, investors were restless. The board was divided. The media was relentless. And worst of all, Aurora was winning. He wouldn't let it continue. Seated in his study, Charles swirled a glass of whiskey, deep in thought. Eleanor sat beside him, unusually silent, while Victoria paced in frustration. This isn't working, she snapped. She's always one step ahead. Every time we push, she shoves harder. Charles exhaled. Then we change tactics. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? Charles set his glass down and leaned forward. We stop fighting her in the public eye. If we keep this up, we'll lose everything before we even have a chance to take it back. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Then what's the plan? A slow, dangerous smirk curled on Charles's lips. We don't attack her corporately anymore. His gaze darkened. We attack her personally. Victoria's eyes gleamed.
Ah.
Now that's an idea. Eleanor hesitated. Charles, he ignored her. Find out everything. Who she trusts, who she's close to, any weakness she has. If she won't break professionally, we'll break her personally. Victoria's smirk widened. Consider it done. Aurora felt the shift before it even happened. Her assistant, Damien, strode into her office, urgency in his every step. We have a problem. She arched a brow. Just one. Damien sighed. They're changing their strategy. No more corporate sabotage. They're coming after you. Aurora's smile didn't waver. Let them. Damien hesitated. Aurora, this could get ugly. They're digging. They'll use anything against you. Asterisk. Aurora stood, walking toward the window, her sharp gaze fixed on the city below. They think I have weaknesses, she murmured. That's their first mistake. Damien exhaled, shaking his head. You're insane, you know that? She turned back, smirking. No, Damien. I'm prepared. Asterisk. Because if the Sinclairs wanted a war, she'd give them one they would never forget. Aurora had spent years preparing for this moment. The Sinclairs thought they were digging for her weaknesses, but they had no idea. She had planted them. Let them think they were closing in. Let them believe they had the upper hand. Then, when they struck, she'd make sure it destroyed them. 2 days later, Victoria Sinclair sat in a dimly lit restaurant, tapping her nails against the table as she waited. The informant she had hired slid into the booth across from her, dropping a thick folder on the table. Everything you asked for, he muttered. Aurora Laurent's past, associates, potential scandals, all of it. Victoria smirked and flipped through the pages. And then, her breath caught. There it was. A photo. Aurora, young, vulnerable-looking, standing in front of a rundown motel with a man whose face was partially obscured. The timestamp placed it years ago, right after she had disappeared. Beneath the photo was a file. A sealed case. Victoria's pulse raced. A scandal? A crime? Something illegal? She needed to know more. Her informant leaned in. It was buried deep. Someone went to a lot of trouble to erase this from public records. Whatever happened back then, she doesn't want it coming out. Victoria's grin widened. Perfect. Find out everything, she ordered. I want details, witnesses, whatever you can get me. The man nodded and slipped away, leaving Victoria practically buzzing with excitement. Aurora Laurent was hiding something. And soon, the whole world would know. Aurora's office. Aurora twirled her pen between her fingers as Damien placed a report in front of her. They took the bait. Aurora's lips curled. Good. They found the motel photo first, he continued. Exactly as planned. They think they've uncovered something damaging. She leaned back, her expression amused. Let them think that. Damien hesitated. Aurora, what's actually in that file? She smirked. Nothing. Damien blinked. What? Aurora leaned forward, her voice silk and steel. I created that file. A carefully crafted lie, just scandalous enough to make them greedy. They'll dig deeper, thinking they've found my Achilles heel. And when they try to use it, asterisk. Damien's eyes widened as realization dawned. It'll backfire. Aurora's gaze was sharp. Spectacularly. The Sinclair estate. 2 days later. Charles leaned over the table, scanning the file Victoria had brought. Eleanor looked uneasy. Are we sure about this? If this is fake. It's not, Victoria snapped. I've verified it. Whatever happened back then, Aurora buried it. And when we expose it, she'll have no choice but to fall. Charles exhaled, considering. Then he nodded. Release it. Victoria grinned. With pleasure. The next morning, headlines explode. Aurora Laurent's secret past. What is she hiding? Mysterious photo raises questions about Billionaire CEO's disappearance. Was Aurora Laurent involved in something illegal? The media frenzy was immediate. The public was hungry for answers. Sinclair Group stock wavered, and whispers of uncertainty spread. And at the center of it all, Aurora remained perfectly calm. She watched as the Sinclair family celebrated their victory, completely unaware that they had just walked into her trap. That evening, Aurora's Real story dropped. a carefully orchestrated press release, a televised interview, and the revelation that shattered the Sinclairs' attack into pieces. The photo? A charity mission. The man in the photo? An undercover journalist exposing human trafficking, whom Aurora had secretly funded. The sealed case? Not a crime, but a report she had helped cover to protect rescued victims from being exposed to the media. Aurora had been helping people, not running from a scandal. And now the world knew. Victoria's phone exploded with angry calls. The headlines had flipped. Sinclair family's desperate smear campaign exposed. Aurora Laurent, the CEO who outsmarted her enemies. Sinclair's humiliated. Corporate war backfires. Charles's face was dark with rage. We've been played. Eleanor covered her mouth, stunned. She set this up from the start. Victoria slammed her hands on the table. That bitch. Aurora, meanwhile, sat in her office, watching the chaos unfold with a glass of wine in hand. Checkmate, she murmured. And just like that, the Sinclairs had lost. The Sinclair family had lost. The corporate war was over. And Aurora had won. But she wasn't done yet. She had spent years being cast aside, ignored, treated as a mistake. Now, she would make sure the Sinclairs felt what she had felt. Powerless, discarded, irrelevant. And she had just the plan to do it. Aurora's press conference was broadcasted live across every major network. She stood at the podium, her presence commanding, her voice steady. I've spent the past few years building Laurent Enterprises from the ground up. I fought, I bled, and I succeeded, not because of my family, but despite them. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. But now I have a final decision to make. The reporters leaned in, hanging on to her every word. Aurora smiled, sharp, knowing. Today, I officially announce that Laurent Enterprises is acquiring Sinclair Group. The room exploded. The Sinclair family, watching from their estate, froze in horror. What? Eleanor's voice shook. Victoria stood, knocking over her glass. That's not possible. Charles's hands clenched into fists. His company, his legacy, was slipping through his fingers. How the hell did she? And then it hit him. Aurora hadn't just outplayed them in the media. She had spent months, years, quietly buying out Sinclair Group's debts. And when their stock plummeted from the scandal, she had swooped in and bought them out. They had been so focused on destroying her, they never saw her coming. Aurora looked straight into the cameras, her voice like silk. And as the new owner of Sinclair Group, I will be making some changes. She turned the page of her prepared speech, but everyone knew what was coming. Victoria, Eleanor, Charles, all of them were finished. She didn't even need to fire them. The board would do it for her. By the end of the day, the Sinclair family name, once feared, once respected, would be nothing but a stain on history. Aurora had taken everything, and she had done it without mercy. Hours later, Victoria stormed out of the Sinclair mansion, her face pale with rage. Where are you going? Eleanor called, voice shaking. Victoria turned, her expression cold. Away. There was nothing left for her here. Sinclair Group was gone. Their wealth, fading fast. The only thing left was shame and scandal. Eleanor watched her daughter walk away, her hands trembling. Charles? But Charles said nothing. He simply sat in his chair, staring at nothing. He had been at the top of the world once.
And now?
Now he was just an old man with nothing. Later that night, Aurora stood in her office, gazing at the city skyline. She had done it. She had returned, not as the ignored daughter, not as the outcast heiress, but as the woman who had crushed the very family that had once thrown her away. And she felt no regret. Damien stepped forward. It's over. Aurora exhaled slowly. Yes. She had won. And the world would never forget Aurora Laurent's rise. Thanks for watching. For more stories, please subscribe Eververse Novel.